Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership. I'm delighted to have a really inspiring leader who I've kept in touch with over the years and been fascinated by his progress from always in sort of senior chief people officer roles in great organizations from Boots, Abbey National, Capital One, Ernst & Young, Freshfields, places like this. And this collective experience of the kind of human side of leadership in businesses, I find very interesting. Now he's set his own business up, giving advice to people. So, I do advise you might tap into his wisdom and experience. But without further ado, I'll let him introduce himself.
Jonathan, thank you so much, and thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. Yes, I am. I've now taken that step to have, hopefully, what I've learned to call an encore career, final phase of my career. I've had an amazing career that I've enjoyed over the last 30 odd years in the world of HR and people and culture and organization development. Working for some great organizations. As you say, I've been very privileged to hold senior roles at those places and enjoyed the variety that it's given me as I've moved from one sector to another, and rather than staying in the same sector and developing my career there, I'm now excited to be, building this new stage of my career, trying to bring the experience that I've gained over the years of working with lots of different leaders, lots of different teams, different organizations at different stages of development with different issues, and to offer some of the wisdom that I've been able to acquire over those years to help other organizations be more successful.
Yeah, well, it's great. And I think you and I are fortunate because we're in slightly different fields within the same area, but that actually, as we get older, we don't get so much more redundant, but actually more useful in some ways, that we've seen a range of different experiences. We can ask some really curious questions because people are, as they rush through their lives, actually getting less and less development themselves as CEOs, sort of pushed into the role or in a board role or whatever it might be. And that's where sort of that trusted advisor is more useful than I think it's ever been. And as you and I were discussing before we started on air, COVID provided, there was no rule book, and you had to almost go back to some first principles of really what you stand for. We were also talking about sort of inspiring leadership and who you found to be inspiring leaders. We discussed three people. Would you just perhaps pick out those who are your favorites of modeling inspiring leadership and what it is about them that you respect and admire?
Yes, well, certainly one of my CEOs at Capital One, Srini Gopalan, is somebody who younger than I was. I guess Srini was probably in his late 30s when he'll tell me if that was not the case. In his late 30s, I think, when he took on the CEO role. Srini's such a clever man. He's really, really clever, but wears that lightly. Has great humility about himself, and in contrast to some other leaders that I've experienced who have been very intelligent, like Srini, the ability to be able to synthesize an awful lot of information and make sense of that, and then to be able to help others really understand what they have been able to analyze. Is a great talent of Srini's, but he did that in a very, very humble way, never grandstanding. His ability to be able to interact with people, whether it be non-executive directors, regulators, through to the security guys on the door of the building. So yeah, I've got an enormous amount of admiration for Srini. There's a chief executive for one of the multi-academy trusts that I serve as a trustee on, Simon Elliott. Simon is, I think, again, one of the most inspiring people that I've met. He's a very different type of character to Srini, but his passion and his commitment for what he's trying to do in improving educational standards in difficult places like Newham and Hackney in East London, and the commitment that he has built in the teaching staff and the support staff in that school, all working to improve the life chances of the kids who go through those schools. Again, somebody who I think is really inspiring leader. And then another, I would say, very different again, Alice Maynard. Alice runs her own business, Future Inclusion, providing advice on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. She's got a range of activities, including being a non-executive board member at the FCA. Alice is disabled. I met her first when I was involved with Scope, the charity that campaigns for disabled people. And I really admire Alice, because not only is she just a wonderful human being, incredibly funny, fun to be with, doesn't take life desperately seriously, but she has overcome many of the challenges that society puts in the way of disabled people in being able to make a full contribution to society.
Fantastic. And there is a theme both in that and in what we've discussed about with your career, Kevin, where, fighting for those less fortunate, even though you realize you've had a very privileged life yourself, whether it be that you, a card-carrying Labour Party member, believing that we should sort some things out, particularly after Boris destroyed the country along with Liz Truss, where I see my poor old son trying to get a mortgage where it's going up to 6% from what it was before. It's very hard. But also this whole area of diversity, equality, inclusion, and being an advisor in certain areas there, and also being an ally and representing LGBTQ plus issues with people. Do you want to just say a little bit about why that means so much to you over the years?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say where it comes from, Jonathan. But for as long as I can remember, I have sort of railed against the unfairness of the world, and how is it that some people benefit from all sorts of advantages of birth, advantages of education, advantages of the people that their parents know, to the disadvantage of other people who may be equally or even more talented than they are. And so I've always had this sense that I would like to make some sort of contribution to making the world a fairer place. Now, I think I've done that mainly in the context of the workplace, and given the roles that I've had, in trying to think about how do I make this workplace fairer. Now, there is also, I have to say, I think, a very, very strong commercial argument. Clearly, organizations need the very best talent that they can get, and if they're fishing in a very limited pool of people who just look like the leaders of that organization, then they're not going to have access to that broad range of talent that is available. I believe that passionately, and study after study has shown that is true. Organizations that are more diverse, that do have inclusive cultures, are commercially more successful. That shouldn't really be a surprise to us. Is, of course, you bring together the talents of different people with different perspectives to tackle difficult problems. And the more brains that you've got in the room that are looking at it from a problem from a different angle, the more likely it is that you're going to get to a really good solution.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you sort of pick out some of the big top-end law firms, professional services firms. It can be quite easy with the old guard to have more people who are just like us, and from our schools and from whatever universities that they went to, that kind of stuff. Without mentioning any names of any organizations, did you find you had to push quite hard in some places you moved into to change the rather ingrained culture of people like us?
Absolutely. People who thought that their organization was already a meritocracy, who felt that the best of the best were rising to the top, and that they were selecting the best of the best, because the best people went to the best schools and the best people went to the best universities, and therefore that's where you should go to recruit. And they are a product of their own experience. They had, I think, relatively narrow lives, and hadn't interacted with people that were very different to them, and so I don't think it appreciated what others could bring to their organisation. So yes, I mean, there were many difficult discussions and debates and arguments about why trying to broaden the range of people that we were recruiting, why we needed to work harder to retain those people that we recruited. Because, thinking back to how the whole, sort of field of diversity, equity, and inclusion has evolved, then, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, it was all about just getting more diverse people into the workforce. And then organizations seem to believe that that's, the best would rise to the top, not understanding some of the structural and cultural barriers that are in place that would prevent that. And so, now organizations do recognize that not only do you need to recruit from a diverse pool, but you also need to work on your own culture to make sure that they feel welcomed and that they feel included and part of that organization, and that there's an environment where they genuinely feel that people like them can succeed.
Yeah. And again, without mentioning the names of the guilty, in your experience, you served in a number of different organizations and you've chosen to move on. Has there been any occasions where you just found it had become so toxic and you were just pushing against a rock that you decided to move on because you just, with the culture you couldn't change, or you suddenly found you were just subtly being pushed to one side because they didn't like what you were bringing? Did that ever happen to you?
Well, it has. It was, I'd say, relatively early in my career. I've been very fortunate, Jonathan, in actually enjoying nearly all of the jobs that I've done, and not many people, I think, can probably say that. So, I've been very fortunate in that regard. But yes, I do remember earlier in my career working for an organisation where I really did not enjoy the culture. I'd previously worked in a much flatter organisation, which was more egalitarian, where more junior people their voices were listened to. In fact, their views were actively solicited. And then the organisation that I was working in was far more hierarchical, very much more command and control, and also I would say that lacked some integrity. A number of promises were made about how that organisation was going to change, and the type of culture that they wanted to embrace. I saw no signs of that at all, and that lack of commitment to change and to become a different type of organisation and to embrace a different type of culture was ultimately the thing that made me think, I'm not enjoying it here, and so it is time to move on and explore something new.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and I think I had to do it once myself as well. And just that recognition of where you fit in, and does it fit with your values? Because I think you're a man with a very strong set of values of fairness and what is right. And we were discussing you reading politics at York University, York, a place dear to your heart and mine. Did that embed further, your views about fairness and right and wrong and the way things should be done? What did you learn from your time reading?
Yeah, it definitely did. And certainly, I wouldn't have just described myself as a geeky kid, but there was a slightly geeky side to me in that, I was so interested in politics. I would go home from school and I'd watch the party conferences. I'd watch the TU Congress and things like this on TV, which was a bit strange for a teenager. So I always had this fascination for politics without ever having wanted to pursue it as a profession. And so I was keen to continue to study that, and studying different political systems around the world and how they worked, different political movements, from authoritarian movements like Peronism to democratic Marxist regimes, and seeing there and learning through that, how leadership and values really does influence culture. And I also, I think, had a sort of a philosophical underpinning. I did quite a lot of political philosophy when I was there, with Plato and Rousseau and John Stuart Mill and people like this, that again I think shaped my thinking as to which I think has probably influenced the way I've thought about the commercial world.
Okay, so let me give you a possible scenario that they get in touch with you and they say, look, Kevin, we know that as a political party, we, the Conservatives, the Labour, Lib Dems, have somehow lost our way. we're not really leading. We're saying one thing and we're doing another. And the public are losing trust in us. What can we do politically to regain the trust of the populace by being better leaders? If you were to give them a few choice words of where things might help a bit in the political world, what do you think should be done?
Well, I do think, again, it's not very different to the commercial world. I think there is something around kind of purpose, around mission. What is it? What is your vision of the world that you want to create? And I would say, do we have a clear vision from any of our political parties today about the world that they want to create? I think that the Labour Party, even though it's enjoying a sustained lead in the opinion polls, it's not quite where Tony Blair was back in the 1990s, and I think that's because Blair, as a political leader, was successful in a way in which Starmer hasn't yet been. He may yet be successful in creating a sense of the type of world that Blair and his team wanted to create. And so that would be my advice. How do you create that sense of purpose, that vision of what it is that you want to create? And that, of course, is the same advice as I would give to a business leader in trying to engage their workforce. Bring that workforce with you, engage them, motivate them, get them to give that discretionary effort. They've got to believe in what you're doing, and that I think there's a direct analogy there between the political world and the commercial world around that vision, that sense of purpose, convincing people about the possibility of creating that, so that they want to follow you and want to enroll in that in the project that you're leading.
Yeah, that's so true. And how do you think it is that it's sort of the whole integrity aspect, and doing the right thing rather than just saying they are? How has it slipped so badly in the last few years? What do you think has gone on?
Well, social media is clearly creates a hugely complex situation for political leaders, because it's very difficult to control their message. And again, Tony Blair in the 1990s wasn't, and I know that you're a fan of the podcast. The rest is politics.
Alistair and Rory, yes.
Absolutely. And but obviously Alistair Campbell was at the centre as communications director for Blair and for Brown in getting their message out. He himself would say he did not have to deal with social media in the way in which politicians and their communications advisors have to do today. It's very difficult to control their message, and there is an access to people are able to gain an audience very easily through social media, and they what they say doesn't have to be true. They can say what they want, and they're not subject to a great deal of scrutiny. And of course, I would be the first to defend the right of free speech. But when that free speech leads to hate crime and such like, then you do need to think about whether there might be some boundaries on that. So I think it is very difficult to control the message, and therefore certain leaders who are able to simplify their message, and that it is something that has a strong emotional appeal, as opposed to something that has a strong intellectual appeal. I think when you see the sort of political leaders who perhaps would be described as populists, they are saying the things that the people want to hear. And that is, the definition of a populist. They are saying the things that are popular with the people, that gain popular support, without them really having a true political philosophy. It's very difficult to say, is Boris Johnson really a true conservative? Is Donald Trump really a true Republican? They are, to some extent, I think, different to the legacy of the political parties.
And that's very interesting. And you made the parallels between business and politics. And when we take that scenario, have you found in some organizations, either you've worked in or you worked alongside, where the CEO and the board, the leadership team, say fine words, are populist, but actually their integrity has slipped and gone? Have you seen that happen in business as much as in politics?
Well, yes, and I think that this gap between saying and doing is fatal for leaders, because today's workforce is super critical of leaders. They have very high expectations of their leaders, and they hold them to a very high standard, and they are interested in purpose and values and culture in a way in which I think, perhaps working generations of the past were less interested in that, and they are far less deferential, and so their willingness to criticize the senior leadership of the organization is far greater. I remember when I was relatively junior in my career, writing a note to go to it went to a main board director that I thought was, very politely phrased, professionally put together, not unreasonable. And I remember my boss coming out of his office, having found out that this note had arrived on the desk of this main board director, with a few expletives, asking me whether what I was trying to do was to get him sacked. Wow. I didn't see that as being particularly critical, but there was this huge sense of deference for the senior leadership of that organization who wouldn't be criticized. Now, no senior leader today would expect to operate in that environment. They know that they're going to be criticized. They know that they're going to be held to account, and therefore there is, I think, much more pressure on them to be able to evidence that they are turning their words into actions, and the consequences of not doing so, tend to be a loss of trust and support for that leader and their leadership team.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And when I think back to your upbringing as a Whitley Bay man and a Newcastle United supporter, a good true Geordie, as you were being brought up with your parents and grandparents, who were both very influential on you, were these values about fairness and how you treat other people, were they embedded in you quite early on, do you think? Or did you pick it up on the way?
Yeah, I think my parents and my grandparents did have a huge influence on me. Yes, I'm a proud Geordie. I haven't got very much of the Geordie accent left, unless you ask me to say cook book, in which case you'll understand where I come from. My two sets of grandparents, they both worked incredibly hard. And so I think values around hard work and commitment and having a strong work ethic were imbued in me by my grandparents. But I observed two sets of grandparents that had different lives. My father's grandparents lived in a nice semi-detached house with a garage. They had foreign holidays. My grandfather worked on the railways and had free travel. He could get out to the south of France on the train, could go on the ferries across to Scandinavia. And so my dad, travelled internationally, when he was growing up in the 50s. Very unusual. My mother lived in a council house. With her five sisters, three to a bed, a 3-bedroom council house. And my grandfather worked for the council. My grandmother took in laundry to add to the family budget. But I kind of wondered, well, why one set of grandparents living like that, and another set of grandparents living like that, sort of a little bit more hand to mouth and needing the support of their sort of, as their families grew up, needing their support, and feeling that there was some unfairness in this, because my grandfather was a very intelligent man. He left school at 14. And read very widely, educated himself, and I admired him enormously for that, the way he had educated himself. Yet, he wasn't able to advance in his career. He didn't have a well-paid job, and so I think that influenced me. My parents brought me up, I think, to value everybody who I came into contact with, regardless. I don't think my parents weren't very deferential, and I think that's something they passed on to me. You treat people as you find them, who they are, for who they are, and not their status in the world. So I am not in the least bit deferential. Status and hierarchy don't impress me at all. In fact, some of the most interesting people that I have met have been people who have, relatively low status jobs, but the lives that they have led, when you talk to them about what they've done, absolutely fascinating. And I enjoy their company every bit as much as I enjoy the company of some of the senior business leaders that I tend to knock around with these days.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've had many proud moments, as we've discussed before we came on air. But also it's quite interesting to others who see someone like you, who look like you've had a gilded career and done incredibly well, worked, as your grandparents would be proud of, very hard, but yet made it look terribly easy, which is quite a skill in itself. A very sort of British approach to doing things, appearing to glide like a swan effortlessly. But you've also seen some tough times, and you've had some dark moments, and particularly in your field, as a chief people officer in the world of people issues. What would you say are some of the darkest moments that you've been involved in, and what you've had to cope with, and what you learned from it, really?
Yeah, well, I think there are individual tragedies, suicides, attempted suicides, people who struggling with significant mental health issues, bereavement, the loss of a child, as a parent, the loss of a spouse at a young age to cancer. And supporting people, through those really difficult times, ensuring that the organisation deals with them in a caring and supportive way. So that there are those individual tragedies that I've had to deal with. Then there's more organisational sort of consequences. Big redundancy programs. People who have worked for an organisation for their entire life. They've never worked anywhere else, and the time comes to tell them that they're no longer wanted by that organisation, and they need to go and do something else. And it's very disempowering to have somebody else tell you that this is the time that you're going to leave the organisation, particularly if you're very happy and you enjoyed your time there and committed your entire career to that organisation. And through into, of course, in more recent times, Jonathan, COVID, which I think is probably the most challenging time of my career. There was, none of us were sort of able to talk to other people who'd been through this before and say, share with me, the wisdom of how you dealt with this global pandemic when it happened last time. We were all making it up as we went along. There's no playbook for chief people officers. And I remember somebody saying to me that the global financial crisis was the crisis where the CFO was called to account and had to step up in saving organizations through those difficult times. But the COVID was the chief people officer's crisis. It's where the chief people officer and the whole HR profession had to step up and help organizations navigate through such uncertain times. And of course, there were again individual tragedies as people lost loved ones to COVID, but also thinking about how do we get the organisation through this, to pivot from everybody in the office to nobody in the office, to all working remotely, to people not being able to go out, not to be able to get together with friends and family, and intense pressures on people, and a huge explosion in mental health issues at that time. That I think, and not knowing how this was going to end, it wasn't something where you could say, well, this is how this plays out. I've done lots of big organizational transformations, and they're difficult. And yes, you deal with redundancies and all the change that comes from it. But you know how it's going to play out. You know where you're headed. You know what the end game is. You know probably how long this is going to last. But with COVID, we didn't have any of that. It was dealing with ambiguity both in the short term and ambiguity in the long term.
Yeah, it is a time where there's been some really harrowing moments. I know from many people I've been fortunate to work with to help them through those moments. And as you say, that rise in mental health, which Lee and I see in our charity, the Inspiring Leadership Foundation, helping those who are victims of violence against women and girls, which increased massively because they were stuck in the same flat with their abuser, and they couldn't go anywhere else. So it's just horrendous. And if you were to give advice to people as they sort of prepare for what's coming down the line, do you think we're going to spend a lot more time remote working? You know, a lot of the city centres, whether it be New York or London, the offices are pretty empty. You know, what is your prediction of you know, how working environment's going to be, and the sort of the impact on people of their mental health as they work more remotely and things like this?
Yeah, well, what I hope happens, and I think this is still, even, you know, a couple of years after the worst of the pandemic, I think this is still evolving, and organisations are still trying to find, you know, what the right mix is between home working and you know, asking people to be present in the office space. And of course, I mean, this is very much a debate really for you know, that largely takes place with professionals, because there are many people who have no choice. I mean, if you're a retail worker, you've got to go into the shop. you can't serve customers, you know, in Primark remotely. If you are a healthcare worker, you can't do your work remotely. So the professional classes have a huge privilege currently in being able to make choices about the way in which they work. What I fear is that organizations are retreating from some of the benefits that we saw of allowing people to increasingly work remotely. And they are being more prescriptive about what people need to do. And it feels as though we're not in an adult to adult sort of relationship, that it's we're going back to rather paternalistic attitudes from organizations saying, well, we know what's best. We know what's best. And it's best if you come into the office 3 or 4 days a week, and we'd like it to be these days that you come into the office, rather than trusting people to figure it out for themselves. You know, I'm a great believer that people will figure this out for themselves. And of course, you'll have a small number of people who will abuse this. Of course you will, as you do in with anything. But the vast majority of people will want to be personally successful. They'll want their customers or their clients to be well served, and they will want their organization to be successful. And they will collectively find the best way to do that. And that it will be different from team to team, from different market to different market, from different practice area or business area to business area. And so being prescriptive, you know, just to me is absolutely the wrong way to go. And what was, I think, truly fantastic about the pandemic, and to look at the some of the benefits that came from that, was that organizations had to trust their employees who they were allowing to work at home, because there wasn't somebody stood over their shoulder watching if they were working every minute of the day. And what happened? Productivity levels actually went up. Now, there's a consequence of that. In fact, probably people did work too hard, and the intensity of it wasn't sustainable. But I think that the way forward is to give people choice, to embrace the flexibility that the technology gives us. We've learned how to work fully remotely. We've learned how to work in a hybrid environment, and trust people and teams to figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Lee and I were working with a big, well-known bank just before COVID hit, and we were dealing with one of their offsites where there was one of the big issues was a couple of people were given permission to have flexible working and could work from home at times, and because they had children, they were allowed to do a bit of flexibility. And the others who were in the office all the time resented this and said, this is not fair. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. They should have to come in like we do, that we all got to be the same. And it was an issue that we were going to try and lance the boil and get them to be more flexible and make allowance for different ways of working, as long as, results only work environment. As long as you focus on a good result and people deliver what they do. Work is as my old brigadier said, I worked for once, work is an activity. It's not a time or a place. And people have this idea, you've got to come to work. And anyway, COVID happened, and they were given laptops, and poof, they all went home, and everybody was working from home. And they went, oh, this is not too bad, really. But now I'm seeing with many of the organizations I work with, who I thought 2 years ago were very far-sighted and flexible and going with the flow, and people were happy and they found ways of interacting. I even had one guy on the podcast who'd written a book all about the last 20 years, where he'd always run his business of 1,500 people remotely. And they just came together 3 times a year. They met at a big sort of barn kind of warehouse place. They had a band that came together for the first time that never played together before, and everybody did great things with their partners. They brought their partners with them from all over the States and from India. I think it was really great. That was fine. And now I'm starting to see, as you say, they're going, no, we want them in on, they've got to come in on, as you say, Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or in fact, no, Mondays and Fridays, the place is empty. We need them to come in on Fridays and Mondays and a Wednesday as well. And not caring at all how that affects the personal life with small children and all that goes on, because they're skiving and they're not working. And it's always the leadership team. They want to be in the office with their people. The people who are doing the job, they don't actually want to be there at all. They'd much rather cut out an hour and a half commuting in the morning, an hour and a half commuting at night, and use those 3 hours either to bit of health and well-being, or be more productive. And as you say, it's becoming very much parent-child, and we don't trust you anymore. So the psychological safety was massive, and it's shrinking. Is that fit with what you've experienced?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that those organizations that continue to embrace the flexibility and the choice will ultimately be the ones that win in the talent market, because talent will choose to do that. All the research shows that people want to be able to make decisions that affect their own lives, and organizations that give them that freedom to make those decisions will be the ones that attract the best and retain the best talent. So again, there's a genuine commercial benefit out of embracing this way of working, as well as it just being, I think, the right thing to do. And I know that the leaders who are, making these demands that their workforce return to the office are worried about things like culture. They're worried about things like learning, development, and they think that if people are working in a totally hybrid world, or not coming into the office very frequently, that that glue that holds them together, that culture, will in some way be eroded. What I say is that well, if you don't attend to it, then that is what will happen. You need to attend to your culture, and you need to nurture that culture, and you need to think of ways of reinforcing that culture that don't necessarily require everybody to come into the office 5 days a week. And that you, as leaders, that is one of the challenges of this age, is how do you build the culture in an organization, in an environment where you have a hybrid workforce? How do you build that glue? How do you build that connection to the organization without everybody being physically present all the time? That, for you as the leadership team, is one of the challenges of this time. And don't rely on the answers of a previous age, which was, we have everybody together, we can talk to them, we can see them, etc., etc. That's the way it used to be done. It's not the way in which it needs to be done going forward. Figure it out.
Yeah, lovely. And then the book was called, if you ever want to read it, Office Optional. And as I say, he'd been doing it before the pandemic for about 15 years. And this way of, he was creative in the way that they came together, or they had a bit of workspace, and they might meet up once a month in hard workspace. They didn't have any offices, and they would all come together for that, do some planning together, and then all splinter and go and get the work done. We talked about values and integrity, and both in politics and in business, how we've both experienced leaders who've, let values slip, or the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. When you've been in an organization where you perhaps let things slip a bit yourself, you just not kept an eye on something, or you found the organization was doing something which, I don't know, might be, you know, mortgage-backed securities, or making money from the poorest in society. What have you done to try and bring yourself and the organization back on track again, seeing that it's slipping?
Well, certainly, look, I've you know, we've all made mistakes during our career. So, you know, individually, I can look back over my career and think about mistakes. And of course, I think it is true. I mean, it's often said, isn't it, that, you know, those mistakes are the moments in which you learn the most. And I think that is undoubtedly true. So a life led without mistakes, well, one, that's an impossibility, but two, it wouldn't be a life that's full of learning. And so what I think, when I recognize that I've made mistakes, Jonathan, what I tend to do is I do have a period of reflection. I do think about it. You know, I try and understand why it is that happened. I talk to other people to get their perspective as well. Yeah, I'm naturally gregarious, so I enjoy talking to people. So it's very easy for me to go out and engage with people, and I don't think I have a particularly high ego need. So, you know, I think people learn that it's actually quite safe giving me feedback. I'm not going to sort of react badly to that. And so, you know, I've found people have been very generous actually with feedback to me through my career. And I don't see it as criticism. You know, I see it as it really is truly is a learning opportunity. So you do need to think about what you're going to do differently. But you do need to think about whether actually you can change. And so, you know, there's certain learnings earlier in my career where, you know, I messed up on something, lost track of a program and how much we were spending on it. We ran up a huge bill without me knowing about it. And so, you know, when my boss was saying, well, you know, how has this happened, you know, Kevin? The answer is because I wasn't paying attention to it. But actually, I don't think, you know, that's the way I am naturally inclined, and it isn't the best use of my talents. And therefore, what I learned was, well, I need somebody to keep an eye on that for me. I've often said, what I need to complement my skills is people who worry for me. I'm not a worrier. Yeah. I'm an optimist. I think, you know, things will work out fine. You know, what I need to be surrounded by is people who are more pessimistic than I am, and are more risk adverse than I am, who hold me back and say, well, hang on, you know, have you thought about this? Have you thought about, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that, and alerts me to, you know, now's the time you need to worry, Kevin. You do need to pay attention to this.
Yeah, really, really well said. And you and I have spoken earlier about purpose, PQ, as I talk about meaning and purpose. And I think you've covered this beautifully, just the vital nature of having a mission, a sense of purpose in your organization. It's a lovely company I work with, Remitly Global, based from Seattle, but they're a global company now. And 11 years, they went from a startup to being a NASDAQ listed company and a unicorn. And that was because they were strongly mission led with trying to improve the lives of immigrants and getting them to send their money back home to their loved one, their families. And it still stays with them. So I think you are very clearly mission driven in what you've sought to do. Let's go on to the next component of what we talk about as the Inspiring Leadership Compass. Just it's 8 points that we found. There's so many thousands of models, but we found it really was a high contributor to high performance. The third one is one that's often left out of many models, which is health quotient, mental, brain health, as we talk about it now. And a fascinating one I'm listening to by Dr. Mark Hyman with a fascinating professor, is that actually mental health issues are metabolic in source, that actually it is our metabolism that affects our brain health. And I just wondered how you would give people tips now at this stage of your career, your life, about looking after your physical health and your mental health, because at times you have and at times you haven't. So what's your top tip?
Yeah, I should probably be paying more attention to my physical health at the moment, I think, than I do. I'm blessed in being, you know, pretty healthy, and so I don't have, you know, any significant health concerns. But you know, I could probably do with losing a few kilos, to be honest. But what I think in the environment that I've worked in, the whole issues around mental health have of course, physical health has been important, and I do think the two are connected, as you say, I think it is pretty hard to have great mental health if you haven't got great physical health, and vice versa. But I think I'm quite fortunate in being resilient. I've described myself as an optimist earlier on in our conversation, and optimism is actually probably one of my characteristics that I'm most grateful for, because I think it has created a resilience in me that I always think that there's an answer. I will get through this. There will be something better on the other side of this. And in terms of dealing with those moments in a career where you're under a lot of pressure, the stress is building up, and without that optimism, I could easily have become very, very anxious. Now, of course, there have been times when I've been anxious about a presentation to the board, a presentation to the executive committee, a particularly knotty problem. But a sustained period of anxiety, I haven't really experienced that, and I attribute this to my optimism. And optimism is something that can be learned. One of the organisations I used to work at, we ran a program called Learned Optimism. And it was for lawyers, and lawyers tend to be people who, through their natural inclination and their professional training, are skeptical and are pessimistic, and that's what you want in a lawyer. You don't want an optimistic lawyer, do you? You don't want a lawyer who's going to say, "Don't worry, Jonathan, I'm pretty sure everything's going to turn out fine." You want a lawyer that's worrying about all the downside risks that you are facing, and has some way of navigating through that. But they need to be able to switch that off in other aspects of their working life, and also of their life outside of work. And so learned optimism, I think, is one of the ways that people can help build their own resilience to inevitable pressures that we're under at work today.
Yeah, and that was the work of Dr. Martin Seligman, who was one of a whole group of people on the sort of positive psychology side, which I'm a big fan of too. And thank you for that. And you're in a field where people expect the CPO and the HR function to be, highly emotionally intelligent. EQ, was the big thing. It was, 5 times more important than IQ, and people were always hiring for IQ, but they weren't looking at EQ. But actually, my experience has been that you tend to get some specialists, very much policy driven, in the HR function, who actually sadly lack huge amounts of emotional intelligence. They know all the facts and the rules, and they're caught in that little world and their silo, but they're not really picking up how people are feeling. What did you do to try and get that sort of your profession to be much more emotionally intelligent and pick up the Fingerspitzgefühl, the fingertip feel the Germans talk about, of what was really going on?
Well, there is a role for more technical, deep technical specialists, particularly when you think about areas like compensation and benefits. And you may not necessarily always find that the skills that will lead somebody to be successful in a deeply technical field like that are necessarily the skills that mean they're going to be very good with internal clients, internal customers. And so there is, I think, a piece around organization design and thinking about who are the people who face off against the internal clients, and making sure that they have the right skills and the right development to engage and truly to treat them as clients, and see them as clients. And as part of professional development, I think it's true in HR, it's true in other professions, that being able to bring your professional expertise to bear with the client requires more than technical expertise. It does require, as you say, it requires this broader set of skills and emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. And so investing in the development of professionals in that domain is every bit as important as investing in professionals in their technical skills, because they can't actually leverage their technical skills unless they have the EQ and those interpersonal skills. Just the technical stuff just goes to waste. And so that investment, I think, in those, people rather dismissively, I think, sometimes call them soft skills. I don't think there's anything soft about them at all, but in the ability to be able to build meaningful interpersonal relationships that are based on trust. That is a skill set that can be learned. People can develop those skills. And in the professional world in which I've worked, it's important both for the HR world and also in the world of the lawyers and the accountants and the consultants that I've worked with.
Yeah, and have you seen the focus shifting from just high IQ, super bright people from the right universities and the right schools, or the right other employers, just like us, to IQ plus EQ? Have you seen that shift?
Sadly, not enough of it.
Yeah.
I think that I've been having the same conversation for about the last 20 years, which is that different things come into vogue, but it is essentially that ability to be able to interact with people that we're talking about. That still too many professionals are promoted within their organisations based on the depth of their technical expertise, and they get promoted into senior roles, and actually their interpersonal skills are pretty poor. Their ability to be able to lead their teams, engage with their teams, understand their teams is not well developed, and so there's still an enormous room for improvement in the organisations in which I've worked. And I would say it's true of all of them. I don't want to call any one out as being better or worse than the other. There's room for improvement in all of them, in truly valuing the rounded skill set that is required for success in a leadership role. Now, in professional services, that leadership role manifests itself in different ways. There's leadership, organizational leadership, more traditional organizational leadership, but there's also leadership in the client sphere and in markets. But that broader skill set is as relevant to somebody who's going to be a senior client relationship partner as it is in somebody who's going to lead one of the business areas.
Yeah, I've seen that so many times, and we used to in the military call it NANP, and in business I call it NANS, not allowed near soldiers or not allowed near people. That they were so bright, but you'd keep them in a little ivory tower working on some strategy or policy, but don't let them be near soldiers or near people. And this is why the military had 2-year tours for its officers on a frontline role, leading soldiers on combat, and then 2 years in a staff job. Whereas famously with General Malchett and Blackadder, there was the rubber desk Johnnies who were always staff officers, and then there were the poor bloody infantry who were out there dying in their thousands. And interesting enough, you and I were talking about the bike ride I did just recently, 500 kilometers in 5 days, through many of the battlefields of the First World War and the Second World War. And it was very powerful for me going back to sort of Passchendaele and Ypres and going through the Menin Gate in Ypres, which my grandfather must have, in the Honourable Artillery Company, walked through as they went forward to the front line, and he got wounded twice during various battles. But just, we have no idea of what that whole generation went through. And I think that really sort of takes me on to my next one, which was resilience. Because, that generation had to learn to be resilient. We're now seeing that for the Ukrainians in a war with Russia that's going to go on for many years. People don't realize just how long it's going to go. When, as someone described it, when a irresistible force meets a non-moving object, there's going to be something going on for a long time. What's your top tip on resilience that you've either practiced yourself or you've seen leaders in business practice?
So I think it's having strong relationships with colleagues. It's a lonely place being a leader in any organisation, and many leaders, I fear, don't talk enough to other colleagues about the issues that they're facing, for fear of being seen as weak, or not having the ability to tackle these issues themselves, not being able to cope. But I think it is true: a problem shared is a problem halved. And I think this is where professional partnerships actually, I think, are pretty good, because some of those relationships have been built up over very many years. And that partners often have within the partnership their own support network who they can go and talk to, or who are nowhere near their sort of the line management structure and what have you, who can give them good insight and advice. And so, I think that far too many leaders see it as a sign of weakness to have to go and sort of seek advice and insight from others. I have to say, I've always found it hugely beneficial to go and say to people, really, and they're incredibly flattered. Jonathan, I'd love your insight into this particular problem that I've got. Your wisdom, all of your experience. Can you help me sort of think my way through this? Chest puffs out. Oh, of course I can. You're one of the people that Kevin's chosen to come and talk to and get advice from. And of course, you don't always need to. I don't need to accept all of the advice that people give. It's entirely up to you to sort of process it and filter it. And you have to use your judgment. But getting those different inputs from different people and different perspectives, I have found, at times when I've been struggling with some problem, feeling the weight of that problem on my shoulders, go and talk to some people. And also, equally, they don't need to be within the organisation. Again, I'm sure, as you have, Jonathan, a number of people who I go to seek advice, and they've been a part of my career for a very, very long time and have seen the highs and the lows of my career and know me very well. And I often go and seek their advice and their views on things that are troubling me.
Yeah, it's essential to have that. So I've just got a very wriggly young black Cocker Spaniel puppy here who's decided to come and join me for the briefing. The other one I was going to ask you about, executive teams. When you've got a toxic team, what have you done to turn a team around?
I think you do have to take some time to do quite a detailed diagnostic. What is it that's going on? It's often the issues that are presenting themselves are not necessarily the root cause of the problem. So it's quite tempting, I think, to try and jump in and try and solve the problem. There's an urgency. It's an unpleasant environment to work in. Decisions aren't being made, or they aren't being made very well, or they're not being implemented very well. So there's an urgency to tackle these issues. Often maybe it's somebody who's asking you to go in and to intervene, and therefore you feel that pressure of wanting to get back to them and say, this is what I think we ought to do, and kind of move to solutions too quickly. So I do think you need to take your time, do a thorough diagnostic. The nature of that diagnostic will obviously vary depending on what the nature of the issues are. But then again, I would encourage people to consult, talk to other people about this, around what some of the potential solutions might actually be. There is often no substitute for tackling the issues head on, and again, it's context specific, I think, as to whether that's done within the team environment itself or with individuals. Often it needs to be done at both levels, with the individuals and with the team. And I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is trying to true back to what is it that we are trying to achieve here? What are we being successful in delivering on our purpose, on our mission? Are we behaving in a way which is true to our values? Are we role modeling those values? To try and depersonalize it, not to say, Jonathan, the problem's you, but to have something to true back to you. And then the problem may be you, Jonathan. But there's a way into that discussion which depersonalizes it by going back to we're really not achieving our purpose here, are we? So let's have the conversation about why that is. I mean, ultimately, and I've done plenty of this, as you would imagine, given the nature of my role, sometimes people do need to be removed from teams. That actually there isn't a fix with that individual. That actually they're not the right fit for that time. The behaviours that they're demonstrating aren't appropriate, and you need to face into that and take that action and remove them from the team. And you have to face up to the fact that that is sometimes necessary. I've done plenty of that, sadly, during my career.
We could have used you in some of the dramas the Conservative Party had lately with who they should be removing, but that's a whole story in itself. Thank you, and I think that's particularly helpful because many go for the just take the action, but actually, as you say, you need to actually do a fair investigation of what's going on. Not take too long, but certainly enough time to see what's required and what changes can be made, which will actually quickly resolve it. Okay, great. We're on the home run now, just the last few minutes. Favorite book, Kevin, on leadership, and why would you recommend people listen to it or read it? I mean, I'm an audiobook man, so if it's in audio version, I'd be pleased. But what would be your favorite?
So it's a book actually I read a long time ago, and I've reread a few times since, Synchronicity, which has a subtitle of The Inner Path of Leadership by Joseph Jaworski. And it's an easy read because it's a story. Jaworski tells the story of his life, and through that, it illustrates how you need to deepen your understanding of reality and get grounded in the reality of what's going on in order to be able to shape the future. If you don't have an understanding of the current reality, how can you possibly start to move towards a different future? But I think importantly, he talks about the need to change the way we see the world, how we understand relationships, and how we make commitments to one another. I found it profound when I read it. Probably more thought provoking than the vast majority of books that I've read, which is why it immediately came to mind. I currently don't have a copy on my bookshelf to the right, because when you asked me that question to think about a book, I went searching my bookshelf to find it, and then I remembered I'd lent it to somebody, and they haven't returned it to me. So they're on my list. There'll be a phone call being made soon to say, I want my copy of Synchronicity back, please. I hope you've read it a few times, given the length of time that you've had it.
Well, that makes me smile. When I was with the Scots Guards in Cyprus, as a dyslexic, I didn't know I was dyslexic at the time. It was only later in life it was worked out, probably in my 40s. But I borrowed a book from the library, which was Teach Yourself Speed Reading, because I thought it takes so long to read. I need to teach myself speed reading. And then a note was sent, which someone found in my pigeonhole. We had a little sort of pigeonhole where little notes were there. And it was from the librarian saying, "Dear Captain Perks, your copy of Teach Yourself Speed Reading is now 2 months overdue. Please could you return it?" And of course I hadn't got round to finishing it, which is only hilarious. But no, thank you for that, Kevin. I'm going to re-listen to that. I remember reading it a long time ago, but I will definitely get that one out again.
Have a read of that. Well, I would say a book that is overdue for return is, we don't really use dictionaries anymore, do we? Because everything's online. But I do have a dictionary, which when I open it at the front page, I am reminded I am supposed to return to the Boots Company, which is my very first
jobs. Yeah.
Somehow that made it out of the building with me when I left on my final day.
Oh, that's great. Well, look, Kevin, would you just introduce yourself in person, say your name and what you do, and share your top tip on leadership?
Sure, of course. I'm very happy to do that, Jonathan. Hello, my name's Kevin Hogarth. I'm a business advisor, a non-executive, and a coach and a mentor. After a long career as an executive in a number of organizations, primarily in the people, culture, and organization space. I don't think my top tip is anything particularly revolutionary, but I do think its importance is as great today as it ever has been, which is about the need to build a team of diverse talents. It's more challenging as a leader to have a team that is truly diverse, of people who are not like you. It's more complex to manage them, to understand them. But the investment that you make in really truly understanding all of those individuals as individuals, what motivates them, what will engage them, understanding them as a true individual holistically, I think is incredibly important. Understand their different abilities and what they have to offer. Support and encourage them. There is, I think, this rule of 5 times more encouragement to criticism. So remember that. Listen to all of the voices. Give all of the voices equal importance. Include everyone in the discussions and the debates. There will be some gems that the most quiet people in your team will offer you. So listen carefully for those things. Recognize their achievements publicly and share in their success. Criticize them in private and not in public. Stretch them with new and exciting work, and be generous in sharing the most interesting things that you do as a team across the team. Help them grow, and most importantly, help them move on to new challenges. Don't be selfish, don't hold them back, but help them progress their careers and take enjoyment and satisfaction through their success.
Kevin, thank you, Kevin Hogarth. It's been a real pleasure having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. You do bring a great wealth of experience from being a chief people officer in so many different organizations. And I'm sure a lot of people will get great value from this podcast. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been an absolute pleasure.